Okay, a little about the flood itself. January of 1927 was the heaviest rain in 52 years. Here's a really crazy example. They couldn't have the major parades for Carnival in New Orleans for Mardi Gras because the horns filled up with water, and so they couldn't play them. That's pretty crazy. The river reached the flood stage early from Cairo, Illinois down to New Orleans. It had also been really, really high the previous fall, so fall of 26. And on February 4th of 1927, the White River and the Little Red in Arkansas flooded over 100,000 acres and left 5,000 people homeless just in our state. In March, then came blizzards. It almost sounds like 2020. Violent storms killed people. It was really, really, really crazy. And the guy, what's his name? Major John Lee, who was in charge of the Mississippi River's Vicksburg office, started preparing, he said, for the equivalent of war because this flood was going to be crazy. From Cairo south, every levee board was operating on a 24-hour basis. Also, the weather was really, really cold, much, much colder than usual. By April of 27, there were 35,000 refugees, mostly along the tributaries of the Mississippi, and the rains kept on. And then on Good Friday, the great storm started, April 15th. In 18 hours, 15 inches of rain fell on New Orleans. Only the United States government standard levees still held. All the rest were just washing out. Levees, as I mentioned, are pretty much made of dirt. And the thing is, there's just a constant pressure from water. Shh, be quiet, cat. The total workforce on the levee just at Greenville was 10,000 men. There were tent cities. They were living in tents. It was very cold. It rained all the time. And at all the weak spots on the levee, that's where they had tent cities and that's where they were living. The people who were doing all the working were black. The people who were the guards, well, you can probably guess, were white. The inspection of the levees was a really, really exhausting task all by itself. White men did that, but all the heavy labor, raising the levees basically was the heavy labor, and that was done with sandbags. You've probably seen pictures from other floods, if nothing else. They had to fill the bags, sacks, burlap sacks with sand, and each bag weighed 50 to 80 pounds roughly, and lift those and take them over and trying to stop the water from coming through. So all the governors, all the senators were calling for federal aid just like they would today, including Senator Caraway, who was from here. The Mississippi governor was asked, this is pretty crazy, the Mississippi governor was asked to send convicts from Parchman Farm to work on the levee. So Parchman was the Mississippi State Pen. And that's how bad things were. They were like, please send all the men from Parchman. Send all the murderers. Yay. An interesting thing in terms of Arkansas-Mississippi rivalry is that the levee on the Arkansas side of the Mississippi River was 18 inches lower than it was on the Mississippi side. So you can kind of guess who's going to fare poorly there. Actually, neither side did too great. But by April, the whole area between the White River and the Arkansas rivers was completely submerged. Let's see. If I do this whole story, I think we're going to be here all night, and I don't want us to be here all night. I will tell you a little more about New Orleans. New Orleans, basically, let me try to sum it up. The leaders in New Orleans had decided that the best thing for the city, which was the wealthiest city all around, partly because of the great trade that they were accomplishing that I mentioned earlier, but a very, very wealthy city, and the people of New Orleans wanted to preserve it. Of course, it's basically here comes the river all the way down the country, and where does it end up? New Orleans. So what the people at New Orleans wanted to do was go a bit above the city and blow a hole in the levee. So that way the water would be diverted, and New Orleans wouldn't flood and they wouldn't lose everything. It was a very, a big city and a wealthy city. So the weakest levees in Louisiana were the ones just above New Orleans. And legally, I mean, this is a long legal story, so I'm not going into all the details of it, but legally, those levees were outside of the jurisdiction of Orleans Parish. So there was a kind of a guy, there was a prominent guy on the levee board named Butler. He was real powerful, and he said the people of New Orleans were panicking and only dynamite would restore their confidence. But other people said, if you do this, it might save New Orleans, but it's going to destroy two parishes, Plaquemine and what's the other one? Oh, I'll find it in a second. It was going to basically totally flood out two other parishes, but it might save Orleans. So the people who lived in those two parishes weren't too happy about that. There were 20,000 men working on the levees between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. There were at least 200 drownings in the Delta in 27, probably more. The property damage the cost of that was put at least $500 million. And that's 100 years ago. There was all kinds of back and forthing about, well, I'll allow the dynamiting of the levee if you will get a signed authorization from the governor and make sure the Federal Corps of Engineers signs off on it. It went back and forth. It was real political. But basically, they ended up deciding they were going to do it anyway. And they brought vans to evacuate the 10,000 residents of those two parishes, and then they dynamited the levee. And then they made with the dynamite, they made a really big, like a ditch, and the water started moving through there. They used 39 tons of dynamite to get that levee out of the way. St. Bernard, that was the other parish, in Louisiana, that's the equivalent of a county. And the thing is, they didn't know. It's so hard to know what a river's going to do, and it was even harder 100 years ago, but actually they didn't need to do that. The way things, like you could tell a few days later that hadn't been necessary. So they went through a lot of stuff for almost nothing. Now, the Great Flood gave a great political opportunity to Herbert Hoover, who ended up later, of course, being president, but he really got his start as, he was called the Great Humanitarian. He was also called the Great Engineer. And those kind of things sort of went together. He was not liked by traditional politicians who, traded money and traded favors and stuff. He wasn't that kind of person. And I don't know, he was a strange kind of guy. I can't tell the whole story about him, I don't think. But let's see, here's just a few statistics. He ended up being called the Great Humanitarian because of what he does in the flood. But first, I want to tell you a few statistics about the flood. 350,000 people were rescued from rooftops, trees, high ground, levees. The Red Cross ran 154, they called them concentration camps? Bad choice of words. 325,000 people, mostly African Americans, lived in these concentration camps. 312 more thousand people outside the camps were fed and clothed by the Red Cross. By the end, they said 250 were officially drowned, but they knew that it was certainly higher than that. Direct economic losses in the neighborhood of 250 to 500 million. And the thing about the flood, it made Herbert Hoover a national hero. So, sorry, I haven't actually read this book since 2007, so I've just been scanning it and trying to take some good notes. Let's see here. I don't know if I'm going to do that whole part. goodness. Okay, we're going to take another little pause.